I think the TLDR of where we are now with voice AI is that we are on the sort of exponential up ramp of voice AI getting really good. It kind of reminds me of video calling only really took off with services like Skype, but you could orchestrate a video call in the 1980s, right? There were ways. And in fact, like, television networks were doing it in a sense when, you'd have like a live news presenter on the field.
Welcome to the next episode of the Chris Rod Max Show. Today we have a very special guest with us on another episode, and we have someone that is very deep expertise in NLP. Would also talk to us a little bit about voice AI, and we are very excited to have you, Andre.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited for this episode.
Awesome. And Rod and I, we chatted about this, yesterday and tried to understand a bit, about what are things going on in the AI world. We thought having you here, especially with your great experience, would really help us to understand. I think for today's episode, what we'll talk a little bit about is on the voice AI side of things, right? What is going on in there? Then we want to spend a little bit of time talking about AI and pricing. And then you also mentioned, like, Stripe's recent announcement. It's quite a lot of AI going on within the company. And then lastly, maybe we'll just close off with some of the I guess cautionary tales, right? What can deep research do and what it can for now. So I guess without further ado, maybe we'll start off with a quick introduction on your background, Andre. I'll pass it on to you.
Sure. So, as you said, my background is originally in natural language processing. I did a PhD in the field pre-LLMs. So back then we were still grappling with NLP subtasks. So I'd like to think of it as a lot of highlighting words, connecting words, translation, etc. So these were all subfields in natural language processing before LLMs really unified the field. I worked in a couple of London-based startups, spent some time applying natural language processing at BlackRock, and then after or during the pandemic, rather, got into Y Combinator, started a pricing startup to help companies optimize their prices. And then more recently, I'm working on a voice AI product to do with market research. So speaking to people to gather information from them. So that's my background and story in short.
Cool. That's super interesting. I think let's start off, your background. So you mentioned something that is quite interesting to me. You mentioned about how generative AI have unified the NLP space. If I wonder if you could elaborate that a little bit, just for my understanding, when you say unify, how does it do it, I guess, from the model itself? Because it's quite interesting from a practitioner itself. Yeah.
It used to be the case that natural language processing and just in general machine learning was split into more manageable subtasks. And so, like, specifically in natural language processing, let me highlight, let's say, three. One would be recognizing named entities in a piece of text. So, for example, the United Nations is a named entity, and one of the use cases of recognizing named entities in text, as you can imagine, is that you can then take them for further analysis. Like, for example, what is the sentiment of the United Nations in this piece of text, and perhaps that leads me to the second subtask, which might be sentiment analysis. It's like, how do you given a piece of text, is it positive about, let's say, a particular entity, or is it negative about a particular entity? So that would, that would have been like a second subtask. Maybe a third subtask would be a translation. So how do you go from, say, English into German, or vice versa? Now, one of the interesting things about this, if we just double click on those three examples, the first example I gave, recognizing the United Nations, that's a word highlighting problem almost, right? The second problem is you take a piece of text and you give a sentiment that is either a classification problem, it's positive or negative, or perhaps you're trying to give a real value, some score between 0 to 1, in which case it's more of a regression problem. And then finally, with translation, that's actually where historically, a lot of generative AI and natural language processing sort of draws its lineage from. Because when you're doing translation, you're actually having to move the entities from one side to the other. You're having to like make sure that the sentiment of the text in English is the same as the sentiment in the text in German. And it's actually a much more general problem. And so translation was actually a very exciting precursor in NLP to some of these modern generative models. But what these modern models have done is, now you can go into ChatGPT and you can give it a piece of text and it'll recognize the United Nations for you. You can give it a piece of text and it will tell you the sentiment for it. You can give it a piece of text and it'll translate it into German for you. And so this is what I mean by, we've gone from these small subtasks to a much more general model.
Yeah, understood. That's quite interesting. It's almost like, let's say I'm a human, I'm able to speak, I'm able to eat, I'm able to listen. They're all different tasks in a way, and then you just combine it all together. Um,
And by the way, we're seeing this story repeat
yeah.
itself, right? Because this is a frequent, repeating historical
Mm-hmm.
pattern, right? Yeah, we've sort of pushed the limits of LLMs now, so it
Mm-hmm.
seems, right? And now we've suddenly moved from pre-training to test time compute, multi-step
Mm-hmm.
reasoning, but maybe even that isn't good enough, and so we need to wrap it in layers of agentic processes
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps even layers of software,
Yeah.
right? And so the hope is that maybe we shake those shackles eventually as well.
Interesting. It's almost like you break it down to such a small task. Now you build it back up, and then you start combining with other stuff to make it even bigger task. It reminds me of like atomic level of adding up of different atoms in order to get to the bigger stuff. Oh, that's super cool. Great. I think thank you for that. That is very helpful. And one of the things that I guess I wanted to check in is around voice AI. So last year, if I remember correctly, a lot of all your larger venture firms out in the valley, a lot of companies are coming up with different types of voice AI. And I guess wanted to get your thoughts on where do you think voice AI is going based on where you spend a lot of your time on, and understanding, I guess, a little bit on how we have come from voice AI so far, and where do you think we are in the cycle, and perhaps we can do a little bit of a future gazing, right? So maybe we'll start with that, and then I have a few questions that I thought would be good to double click on. Just want to give a general view to listeners.
For sure. So I think the TLDR of where we are now with voice AI is that we are on the sort of exponential up ramp of voice AI getting really good. It kind of reminds me of, video calling only really took off with services like Skype, but you could orchestrate a video call in the 1980s, right? There were ways. And in fact, like, television networks were doing it in a sense when, you'd have like a live news presenter on the field. Similarly, so I remember speaking at one point to the founder of DeepGram, which is most famous for one of its speech to text models, so transcription models. And he was telling this funny story about how, and I'm not sure if this, if I'm sort of correctly saying this now, but as far as I remember, in the early 2000s when he was doing his PhD in physics, they actually came up with a voice AI like model that they could speak to in their lab, and they would just speak to it. Now, it wasn't particularly good, and it was slow and everything, and there weren't many use cases for it back then. But now, truly the big unlock has been a couple of things. So the first thing that has been an incredible unlock is, of course, large language models, right? The ability to have a general model that, regardless of what someone speaks to the voice AI, and usually when people speak to a voice AI, there's a long tail of idiosyncrasies, right? Names can be spelt in different ways. Booking a table in a restaurant can be said in innumerably many ways. So LLMs are actually very good at processing that. The other sort of unlock, of course, is tool calling, right? The ability for LLMs to call tools to then be able to action on something and then return it back to the user in spoken form. And then finally, the tech has just gotten really good in terms of the speech to text models, the text to speech models. Voice realism has improved massively. We now even have sound in, sound out models that aren't as pipelined as previously. But there are still bumps in the road. And so I expect in the next 12 months, those will be ironed out. And there was some really interesting news. I'll stop in a second, but there's some really interesting news that came out, I think just the other day, with a new model from, I think, Sesame AI, which is now really pushing the boundary of reaching a voice AI model that you actually enjoy speaking to.
That's fascinating.
And I think the crux of it is that voice AI speaking to an AI is actually pretty annoying, right? Like, let's be honest. And like sometimes it's a bit fun, but as soon as it makes its first mistake, you kind of drop it. And so I think that we will hit a point where that isn't the case anymore.
Andre, taking a step back, you were mentioning that we've been having this technology already now for some decades. And yeah, sure, let's say like in the 80s, maybe 90s, it was clunky, it was hard to use. And in recent years has gotten much better. However, if we think about it, we don't really see that much voice as an interface. For example, we tried a few years ago with Siri and all these assistants, and they really didn't catch up. Then they didn't have so much adoption. Do you have any thoughts why that might be? Is it really because we humans prefer to communicate some other way, or maybe it was just the technology that was maybe non-responsive, maybe it was clunky, ineffective?
Yeah, for sure. So I would bifurcate this into business use cases and consumer use cases. So on the business side, the problem with voice AI historically has been the fact that achieving high enough accuracy to make voice AI palpable for business was really difficult, right? So you have companies, let's say the London-based, Poly AI is an example of a company that works with large enterprises to automate their customer support calls. And one of their big use cases is actually a subset of sort of, if we call that customer support, is bookings, right? So, bookings for a restaurant, bookings for a pub, bookings for a gym, etc. And as I mentioned, there's a really long tail of ways in which you can book a place. Like you might call with a very unique name for the local UK context. You may call saying, I need a table for 4, but oh, by the way, there's a child coming as well, and so I need a children's seat. And so there's just, so many ways that you can say that. And so the way you tackle that pre-LLM was by building all sorts of very Byzantine pipelines to make sure that you can handle that. Now, what we're seeing now is the ease with which you can get extremely good accuracies has suddenly improved. And so on the business side of this bifurcation, what we are seeing now is a large amount of adoption for low stakes calls. So what are low stakes calls? So for example, if you're doing a debt collection call, right, where you just need to continuously remind someone like, oh, by the way, you should probably, pay us, the business, this or that. Or if you are doing slightly higher stakes, if you're doing routing in freight, for example, you might want to have a centralized agent that, let's say, a driver may want to call into to then converse without having to speak to a human. There are cases where the stakes are way too high for voice AI to work. And so in, outbound sales, for example, what we're seeing in outbound sales, for example, is a spike in demand testing where people will automate cold calls basically to gauge demand. But I don't think we're quite seeing, actual applications of outbound sales calls yet by some of the world's largest enterprises to try and actually close sales, right? That's seen as too high stakes for them. So on the business side, lots of application, lots of traction already. On the consumer side, I think the biggest blocker is very simply, the believability of the voice. I mean, I really encourage anyone listening to go to Google and type in Sesame AI and then, click on the first link and it'll take you to the website of probably the latest, best voice AI model that's out there, and it's very, very good. So what do I mean by believability? Maybe to double click on that, what I mean by that is, when we speak, the tone of our voice typically adapts to the current context that we're in. Like, I'm not speaking to you in an ASMR voice now, right? I could probably convey the very same information that I'm conveying now, holding my microphone really close to me and speaking in a sexy voice, but it would kind of defeat the purpose of how these podcasts are typically done, right? And so there's, and that would be a mismatch. Now, there's oftentimes a mismatch between the way a voice AI speaks to you, as some like horrendous, agreeable, hyperactive American, right? And your sort of tired 11 p.m. self that wants to chat to a voice AI about whatever it is he wants to chat to it about. So on the consumer side, I think it's a lot more about believability, and I think we are going to get there soon.
I just want to say that one thing that I feel, especially on the consumer side, it is maybe we're already conditioned by decades of very limited systems. And then, for example, for my case, when I'm on the phone and or maybe like or just having some conversation and I notice a system, I was wondering what's actually possible. Maybe what I'm saying, the system might not understand it. So I was very cautious on what to say, and I wonder, will it be interpreted yes or no, and so on. So I feel that maybe it's already that we're used to having non that effective systems, clunky systems, and then therefore we are maybe a bit very cautious of what to say, what not to say.
Yes, and I think there's a parallel there to be drawn between how coders used to feel, or still feel, perhaps. When you're coding, you're typically conditioned to be very diligent to make sure that the code compiles and runs and is correct, and the unit tests are written, and that you're properly architecting it, etc. And now we're moving into a world where people are vibe coding, right? So people are sitting on Cursor, they're sitting on Anthropic code or Claude code, they're sitting on these various AIs, and they're basically almost like if they were on TikTok. They're basically giving it very simple instructions: just do this, do that, next, 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 until whatever compiles and runs on the other side is what they deem is what they wanted. So in a sense, it's a lot more creative, it's a lot more artistic, it's a lot more, another kind of, like, I think a really good example of this is Adobe's I believe it's called Firefly, which is, and I believe it's free or partially free, and you can play with it online. But it has some incredible UX patterns that are very flow state inducing, right? And so I think that we've definitely the field has one of the things that you can argue AI has unlocked is the ease with which we get into a flow state, right? So we can do complex market research, or like we can talk about complex things with an AI without having to walk over to the bookshelf and open a calculus book to learn about something we forgot about calculus, right? So it's sort of like lowered the barrier to entry into a flow state. And I think that voice AI is probably one of the last ones to that will reach that.
That's very interesting. I think when you say about lower the barriers to flow, it's almost like bringing the natural part of natural language processing back a little bit, making it a lot easier to to start a certain task to get into that flow state, as you mentioned. I think that's fascinating. And then one thing that you mentioned that earlier, which is around how businesses are outsourcing a lot of those lower tasks over to AI. I think for our listeners, especially the business users, do you have like some sort of framework that they can use it to think about how they should implement voice AI, right? What would deem as low stakes, for example, for them? I mean, obviously there are quite a few examples out there, but you'd love to hear it from you.
Well, I think the most natural thing to look at is, do you have existing call volumes of any sort, right? Whether it's inbound, outbound, whether it's internal, perhaps. And in cases like that, you should really be asking yourself, is this automatable, or is a portion of it automatable? And I think in general, it is the way to think about what is automatable, what isn't, is as a function of risk, right? And of course, risk is very specific to your particular use case. And so, you should be obviously grounding that in your particular context and use case. The other thing I'd say is there are also, interesting voice AI applications that fit outside where existing call volume is. And so another thing that I would encourage people to just think about for themselves is, could you, given that, in this case, the barrier to making a call has now drastically fallen because you can get an AI to do it. Are there cases where you could be leveraging voice AI to improve typically various forms of information gathering or various points of, customer or prospect touch points? So as an example, if you're running an e-commerce business, and an existing customer has added something to the basket but then not checked out, would it make sense to give them a quick call to just ask, oh, by the way, we saw that you had something in the basket. Are you still interested in purchasing or buying this? Or perhaps you want to gather feedback on the experience. And so you could launch a call and then have a very short 30-second conversation about what that was. And so now you're automating speaking to your customer in a sense. So, these are cases which previously just you could not do because they were way too expensive to get humans to do. Now you can. And so, yeah, look at either existing call volume, try and see if you can automate a portion of that, or apply it to net new use cases in your given context.
Data. So many large organizations, basically every large organization has some sort of like call center, customer support, and so on. And I'm sure that many of them are thinking, hey, I want to start producing voice systems as a way to automate all this process. And you mentioned that technology is getting quite good. You were now mentioning about Sesame AI, many new models in the market. But how should companies go about deciding which system to buy, which vendor? Is there like a checklist or any hints, best practices that you might have, how they can make that decision?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so obviously it really depends on, the size, I guess, of the business that you are in or running. And so if you have existing call centers that are doing this, I mean, obviously the first question to ask is this a BPO style outsourced call center, or is it something you already have in-house? Perhaps you've built some of your own infra for this, perhaps you haven't. And I think that you can probably divide checklists into two. So, one is the usual procurement checklists that, vendors need to go through. And so I'm not going to comment on those because I'm sure that, everyone has those. But I think the ones that are more AI specific are perhaps more interesting, which is, I think one thing to assess is the end-to-end resolution rate, as it were, that a system like this can actually provide. Because oftentimes in customer support specifically, but I guess you could generalize this to other applications as well if you kind of, reformulate it a little bit. It's really the end-to-end resolution that counts, right? It's not like first touch point AI says hello, and then Bricks doesn't know what to say, and then there's a handover to a human, which was one of the big problems in the 2010s of AI companies, voice AI or not, trying to automate customer support, right? It's like they would get you 60, 70, 80% of the way there, but not 100. And so in the end, it was actually oftentimes introducing a lot of complexity, into the flow as opposed to necessarily solving many things. So yeah, I mean, and there are other metrics that, CX professionals track on that side, but I think one that is just, hits home to me, and one of the startups that I worked in the sort of 2015, 2020 period was an AI startup looking to automate customer support, is really, figuring out like end-to-end resolution capabilities of whatever AI system you're adopting, and then also coming up with sort of an impact distribution across those, right? So if you're only automating, it's very easy to like hack end-to-end resolution scores. If let's say you consider end-to-end cases where, you know, a customer kind of says, oh, actually, I don't need help. It's fine. Bye. Right. Or, you know, oh, when are your opening times? Right. So those are kind of easier ones, but, you know, is it actually automating the things you wanted to, you need most help with is a great metric to track.
Yeah, I think the incident resolution thing is interesting because I can see this happening, for example, in all those gyms, right? So if you go to gym or go to classes once or twice, then they want to upsell you and tell you to buy like a whole year of membership. Normally what they do is they will just have their folks that are sitting in front of the front desk and start calling you. It's like, you don't need that. You can probably batch everything. um,
Yep.
Cool. And I guess, we spent some time talking about voice AI. I want to shift gears a little bit, talking about AI and pricing. I think the way I think about it is there are two ways, right? One is how AI and pricing will change the way we price stuff, number one. Number two, we can also see how AI companies are pricing themselves, right? And there are quite a few stats out there where, companies are growing 1 to 100, 1 to 10 million in record speed. And in my head, when it comes to revenue, it really comes down to pricing multiplied by volume and just trying to understand, what exactly is going on here. Is it because they're just a huge volume, or is it because they're charging more for those products? So I guess, then just distinctly separating them. But I would love to get your thoughts, Andre, given that you've run AI companies yourself. Maybe we'll start off with the latter part, which is, how are AI companies pricing themselves? And then we can talk a little bit about how, the market is changing pricing in general. So maybe we'll start off with that. What are your thoughts around, AI companies reaching, crazy amount of revenue in crazy amount of short time?
So I think the short time frame, first of all, I mean, sort of disregarding pricing for a second, the short time frame thing is, I think, a function of, three things. One is the value, right? That's like, undoubtedly AI is providing value in certain cases, not all, but in many. And the other is actually also just timing, right? We are in a time where the tech industry in aggregate, the software industry, the sort of like TAM of the software industry in aggregate is actually higher. So oftentimes when you see companies, when you see these metrics on Twitter of how fast some of these companies are growing, they are sometimes forgetting that, like, well, but they're comparing these AI companies to SaaS companies that were started years ago when the TAM was smaller and the market dynamics were different and so on. So, but obviously that's hard to separate out in such business analysis. And then, I think the third thing, which is really fascinating about the, I guess, pace of adoption, is just the fact that, this is one of those big secular changes. When, the world moved into cloud, you saw something similar happen. When the world was obsessed with data scientists, everyone had to have a data scientist.
We still are, by the
and
way.
So we still are. We've kind of forgotten about big data, I think, though. But this is another one of those things, right? Like, we all need to do AI. There are countless middle managers that are now doing AI. I remember in finance, I was in BlackRock just when the world went from, like, no one ever heard of ESG to, like, everyone was doing ESG. And you could actually tell, because you would sit in cafes here in the city of London, and, within a week or 2 weeks, suddenly well-dressed people in suits were talking about ESG. And this is another one of those moments, right? So, for better or for worse, we're all in this together, and I guess we all need AI. And so that's really what's, frothing the industry.
Andre, on that matter, so you were saying that now we need to do AI, or before we need to do the science. What's the current state of the game? Because now we can say that we have those like three disciplines that are a bit so tangential, but not exactly like overlapping. We have the science, we have machine learning, we have AI. Does every company need to be doing AI? Do they need to be doing the science, for machine learning?
No, I don't think so. I think that, there are plenty of companies and use cases out there where I think you don't need to be doing AI. If anything, I think the kind of anti-cyclical play here is, or thing that I expect to happen, rather, is that there will be a premium on the human experience moving forward, right? If it is true that AI will take over the world and, loads of people will lose their jobs and we will automate a bunch of low-hanging, low-level tasks, then I think that human experience component starts becoming way more important, right? And so, you don't need AI for your Pilates studio. Like maybe some of the SaaS stuff that you use in your Pilates studio might have some AI, and that might be tangentially helpful. But in reality, what you're optimizing for is the human experience of a well-led Pilates session, right? And so perhaps there will be more and more of that. It could be that, actual human-to-human support, white glove style human support, will become much more important in a world where, a lot of these like low-level FAQ style AI task questions are now solved for. So, I think we're just, a lot of things are going to relocate, but I think one of the problems that industry in general has is that when these big shifts happen, when the whole industry starts talking about, let's say, ESG, then suddenly what you have is this like proliferation of bullshit projects that are being done by small, like middle managers and large enterprises and teams because they're angling for a promotion. And what I would say is it's really important to like step back and really think about your company or the industry or the market as a whole, and not get too obsessed over whatever the current secular trend shift is.
Absolutely. Everyone could use a little bit more research, as the crypto bros say, do your own research before you jump into anything else. And I guess just coming back on the pricing stuff, we talk, I thought, it would be quite interesting given that you were working on pricing on AI. So one of the things that I've read online, I think it was Bain or BCG that wrote this, how AI could change pricing where you could make it flexible enough to respond to whatever the market landscape is. So wanted to get your thoughts around that, how AI will affect pricing of different products, services, going forward. Given that, you spend some time here, I'd love to hear a little bit, I guess, your thesis around this, and where are we?
Yeah, so I think so first of all, one of the big limiting factors to pricing flexibility is actually billing, right? Because billing is how you collect whatever you've priced, right? And so you cannot price something in a way which your billing solution does not support, right? So actually, one of the things I'm very excited about is this unleashing of the flexibility of billing solutions, right? So as an example, Stripe at its core, a payments company, is now also a billing company, right? There is Stripe billing and you can bill for it. Now, Stripe was actually late to the billing game. Loads of other companies were doing billing before, including companies that were doing subscription billing, which was like a new form of billing actually at one point. And, Zora famously was the one that kind of introduced that at enterprise level, and you had companies like Recurly, ChargeBee, and so on that did it at a more of a consumer level or like smaller scale level. But the flexibility of billing is really the limiting factor for how you price. And so what do I mean by that, right? Like one of the big things that everyone's talking about now is outcome-based pricing, right? So, this idea that if it's true that we're moving into a world where instead of, software as a service, we have, we basically have service as a software, right? That like, AI can, automate what a consultant does, let's say. Well, then you're going to be judged on the outcome, that on the finished product, on the deliverable that you provide to the buyer. And I think one of the fascinating things about anything that is outcome based is that obviously it's always to a degree a matter of interpretation as well, because the outcome could be bad, in which case you enter a dispute. And so I think like there's going to be an increase in, if the world moves towards that, and I don't necessarily think it will, but if it does, then dispute management, like post-delivered product or post-delivered work, is going to be like really important to billing solutions. And so, and that's just, one kind of like deep dive into kind of pricing and AI. But stepping back for a moment, again, if you bifurcate this into B2B and B2C, I think what's really fascinating on the B2C side is that the world has somehow decided that $20 a month is the price, right?
Very true. Yes.
And it's not quite sure why. I mean, but it
Mhm.
is, and cool, that's fine. And now we're seeing with test time compute and multi-step research and all of this, we're seeing the higher price points because the costs of providing these services are that much higher. But like for a very long while, it was like, yep, it's $20 a month. And I think one of the fascinating things there, and this isn't specific to AI, by the way, but one of the fascinating things on the consumer side is there's going to be a growing maturing of how flexibly these companies price. So, they're going to go from $20 a month to good, better, best, which many of them already have. So $20 for, plus $200 for pro or whatever. We're going to see cases where there will be add-ons. We're going to see cases where there will be pricing that's specific to different geographic regions, right? So oftentimes a lot of tech pricing starts off as very US biased, and then eventually, figures out that it actually makes a lot more sense to discount in certain geographies, et cetera, et cetera. So but that's not specific or unique to AI. I mean, it's just something that will naturally happen. On the business side, I think what's fascinating, of course, is you're selling units of compute in a sense, right? And so you basically very naturally need a usage-based billing model, and that's exactly how these AI companies have been pricing and billing. And so when you're pricing and billing for a usage-based model, you're talking about, committed usage bands, you're talking about, discounts on volume. And again, none of those things are necessarily unique to AI, but that's just the way that these things are being priced. I think what's interesting, of course, is also the ratio between the actual cost of running these services, which is dramatically falling, and, and the price. But I think that kind of removes us from the pricing conversation a bit too far, so I won't comment on that. But yeah, that's kind of like how I see it set up and where I see it moving, and maybe also that, what I see with the outcome-based pricing.
So I think that, so number one, I think I totally agree. So I used to work for a very old software company that sells software to banks. One of the big reasons why we can't change the pricing is exactly like you said, because our billing system couldn't handle it. I was like, are you serious? It's like we have one of the top software that is so captivated with, the top large banks, but we're unable to change the pricing, not because our client don't want to pay it, it's because we have no idea how to bill it eventually. And that resonates a lot with me. It's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think the one of the things which this like unleashing the flexibility will definitely bring is because two things will happen, right? Like the billing primitives are going to get more and more flexible. So what I mean by that is like Stripe billing is going to mature, as is the billing of all the other providers, and so it'll be possible to set up, let's say, a like multi-part invoice with a subscription and like some tiered usage thing with discounts that also is then edited because you renegotiate the contract a month later because the customer CFO is really angry or something, and so you need to do that edit, but actually doing that edit is really hard, and like many current billing provide, blah 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 blah. So the primitives are going to get better, but the other thing which is really interesting is I think that as soon as the primitives get better, because pricing is all about how do you match what it is you're selling to the value that you provide, like, right, like that's the fairest setup between in this sort of like relationship that businesses make between each other and between themselves and consumers. And oftentimes it's billing that's in the way. But I think when billing kind of gets out of the way, there is going to be a moment in time where like we're not actually going to grok the coolness of how like flexible we can get. So what I mean by that is, you know, there are companies, for example, that have spent time building up their internal billing so that it's highly flexible. And what it allows for that, it allows for their sales reps to be extremely flexible in contracting. So like without having to go to some deal desk that like structures some complex deal for a high ACV item, you can have a seller that's, I don't know, selling point of sales terminals to restaurants, on like a monthly subscription, going in there, coming up with a custom deal, right? 3 months, don't pay us, then pay us at a discounted rate for 6 months, and then, and then go on to the full amount by year's end. And by the way, if we don't hit our SLAs or mess something up, there's no lock-in, and you can get X amount of this of refund or whatever, right? Like any kind of complex contracting situation, like those things were typically privy to some of the most complex high ACV deals that deal desks would have to figure out before. Now we're going to move into a world where sales reps or rather AEs and stuff will be able to close these deals as flexibly as some of those larger deals were closed before.
And you mentioned that we're moving towards outcome-based pricing. And my experience with AI systems is that often they do not get it right the first time, right? So you want to have something. In classic case I've seen for this outcome-based pricing is, for example, with CRM. I say, hey, I'm looking for some leads. They'll say, I need an AI expert based in London and these characteristics. And often the results are not the right ones. However, the vendor has already incurred the computational cost of calling the model. Maybe this is something hosted on OpenAI or somewhere else. So for the vendor, the cost is already there, but the outcome was the wrong one. So what can vendors and also AI buyers do in those cases where on one side I'm maybe paying for something that's wrong, or the other way around, I need multiple tryouts before I get the right outcome in order to be able to charge?
Yeah. So broadly, two things, right? One is you either basically say, look, there are pass-through costs here, and the pass-through costs are the cost of using these foundational models, which is the cost of providing the service. And obviously on top of that, I'm giving you a margin, which I'll pocket. But if this goes south and it doesn't work, then please at least pay for the pass-through costs. Obviously, sometimes they might not even want to do that, right? And in cases like that, I think that, in software, we lived in a world where, build it once, sell it a million times over. The actual cost of running a piece of SaaS software is very low. Now we live in a world where margins are actually lower, at least for the time being. That might not be the case in the future, but at least for now, the COGS are pretty high in AI. And I think in cases like that, you just take a leaf out of service businesses, and service businesses are incredibly good at setting expectations, right? As opposed to like software businesses, which oftentimes things don't work or whatever, but it's fine. Like, if they, if they cancel, it's okay. Like, you're not, at least on the cost side, you're not stomaching some giant AI bill. So I think it's either be very upfront about the pass-through costs, the fact that you may be a wrapper around existing foundational models in an application layer company, and there's nothing wrong in that. One of the sort of best spaces to be in, or get damn good at setting expectations when you contract, and just foresee situations where things don't go well, right? So like in software, we used to do that in SLAs, right? So an SLA document would define what would happen if we didn't hit our SLAs, and sometimes the customer would be credited with sort of like additional credits that would offset some of the price that they had to pay because the company that was providing the services did not meet the SLAs. I think we can take inspiration from that in how we contract for AI products.
Great. I think just to comment on the outcome-based pricing, one thing that reminds me of it would be like, I don't know, let's say like investment banking, right? They were charging based on how much they raised for you. Let's say, for example, they raise capital for companies. So I think you're going to make a lot more sense, or should I say, make a lot more money from that. But at the same time, you're also taking on more risk because there will be days that you have a fixed cost base, but then you don't really drive revenue in, or the revenue that you drive in is too low to be able to sustain that base cost. But I do like the way you think about it. If there is a base cost, you want to always pass on the base cost in a way. So think of it like consulting, right? So they will still charge up based on the hours, but then there's still extra stuff on top that they will be able to get to you. So those are all services-based business.
Yep. Yep.
Cool. In the last 7 minutes, there are two more topics to cover really quickly. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's really good. And last thing is around Stripe. So Stripe obviously recently announced their latest results. And I think 3-4 days ago, and their total volume reached like 1.4 trillion. I remember listening to their goal, which is to grow the GDP of internet. I think that has always been the mission. It's always very interesting. And in what caught my eye this time is around the announcement, everything on AI. Like on Stripe, there's like 4 different things. They're a payment company. They talk about like 4 things on AI and 1 thing on stablecoin. So I wanted to get a little bit on your thoughts around AI, given that we spent some time talking about billing, right? So they are now one of the largest billing, right? Used by 300,000 companies, nearly 200 million of active subscription that's on Stripe. So I'd love to get a little bit about your thoughts about how, how payments and Stripe is tackling the AI world from your perspective. And then, we can go from there.
Yeah, so a couple of scattered thoughts very quickly on the Stripe annual letter. So Stripe isn't a public company, but they publish an annual letter anyway. And so we know some of their, higher level metrics as a result. And what's really interesting, so a couple of things that struck me. So the first one was that, Stripe's, I guess, biggest near-field competitor is Adyen. Now, Adyen typically services enterprises, so they kind of won't speak to you unless you're doing, I'm making this up, but like, unless you're doing, I don't know, 40 million in annual revenue, it's, you should probably be using something else. But where Stripe is, Stripe's bread and butter is getting you at the very beginning, right? So Stripe Atlas is how many companies incorporate. Stripe billing is basically how YC bills or YC companies bill for the most part, etc. And then sometimes they'll sort of shift out of Stripe as things get more complex. And Stripe's goal has been to mature their billing systems, grow their payment coverage internationally as well, to make sure that they sort of keep up with the larger customers, of which they have many as well, right? It's not just it's not that they don't. But one of the things that struck me was obviously like the valuation multiples, right? So Stripe is now valued much more highly than Adyen, even though they have like very comparable results at the moment. And that could just be, the sort of, private market premiums that you get. But also, I think it's also a reflection of the fact that Stripe has really kind of like doubled down on the AI billing space. Right. So most AI companies use Stripe. They don't use the other providers. And if it's true that AI will take over the world and, we will have AI agents shopping on our behalf with cards that they have, then, it could be the case that actually Stripe is extremely well positioned to be able to, grow in that space. Another thing which they don't really talk about, I think, in the annual letter, but I'm sure you've seen it, is you may have seen Stripe links. So when you pay for OpenAI now as a consumer, you're actually setting up a little consumer kind of Stripe account, as it were, tying your debit or credit card to be able to be easily reused in other situations where a company is using Stripe. So I think those are the beginnings of something potentially really incredible for Stripe. So it's a very sort of revealing annual letter in terms of, I think, strategy and where they're going.
Absolutely. I think just to add to that, one thing I remember seeing is around the agentic payment stuff, which is, tied to what you were mentioning, which is if I can get my card and then carry it along all the different websites, save me from typing it in, but at the same time, the merchants won't have my information because it's on my agent that I control. The second thing is I can then tell it to go buy me some t-shirts, right? I think this was the John Collinson example on the podcast that he gave, which is just go out there and buy stuff for me. I think that will change how commerce are done down the way. But also to your point, it becomes more natural. It lowers the barrier to get into the flow state, but also lowers the barrier to get to do all these low level tasks. You just don't care about it, right? Just get on with it. So it's quite fascinating. And I think the other thing is, combined with what they're trying to do around stablecoin for cross-border payments, I think that will change everything. So it is quite exciting. I mean, from your perspective, given that you're building, in the, let's say, AI and market research space, how do you think about this? I think what will happen is they will eventually be able to see where the world is going from an economy perspective if everything moves online.
Oh, yes. So I did sort of catch, I think it might have been either Patrick or John on one of the podcasts talking about how they came up with an inflation prediction model, right? Which is pretty cool. So yeah, I think that, there's a lot of interesting things that can be done, assuming that the world fully moves towards, I guess let's call it programmatic payments, like easily programmable payments. Just the other day, so I'm originally half Slovenian, half Serbian. We used to be sort of a Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia. And one of the interesting things that companies in Yugoslavia did is that they would submit the debts that they were trying to collect to a government agency every month or every quarter. And then that agency would actually cancel out any circular debts, so that you wouldn't have like banks or other financial actors taking a take rate or a commission or whatever, right? Like on those transactions. If we do live in a world of like very easily programmable payments, then there's loads of interesting things that I think could happen in the future.
Totally agree. Great. I guess last 1 minute. We're gonna finish off this because we did promise to do this. Obviously, I think many people that listen to this either know or don't know Ben Evans, which is used to be an investor with A16Z, and he's also a prolific researcher. I guess he has been, giving us a dose of reality of what AI can do or cannot do. And he recently wrote like an article, what can deep research do and what it can't. I guess what's really interesting to me is, he wrote like a line in there, which is, AI models are very good. They can do things that computers can't do very well, but they're also very bad at what computers can do very well. So from what a computer can't do is any sort of probabilistic stuff, because computers are inherently very good at deterministic stuff. So when it comes to deep research, probabilistically pulling information from multiple different places is great, but when you want it to pin down to something very specific, it's becoming a little bit more wonky at the moment, right? But it will get better in the future. But I thought it would be good to get your thoughts, Andrej, given that you went all the way from relating different entities when we talk about in the start to now, people are taking those different subtasks and put it all together. So wanted to get a little bit of your thoughts around this.
Yeah, and apologies to your listeners who timed the 1 hour podcast. I maybe we should go slightly over. Okay, so two things. The first is that it's true that what AI is really good at these probabilistic things. It's not particularly good at some of these more deterministic computer-like things. However, I mean, I would argue against that somewhat in saying that, well, you can always adopt an intermediate representation to do some of the more deterministic things. And actually, AI is incredible at coding, right? Which then translates into a deterministic action across some data. So for example, if you're trying to do data analysis, right, and run some SQL queries, then you can either like give the entire spreadsheet to an AI and it'll sort of generate the answer immediately, or it can actually generate some code that then runs across your table to then generate the answer for you, right? So I do think that, I mean, if we just plot the trajectory of how good AI has become at that, and is getting better and better at that, it's been, it's truly amazing, right? I remember, back in the 2010s, there were people trying to like, generate SQL code and kind of nothing was working. And now it really is. But back to the Benedict Evans essay, I mean, one of the things which I think, deep research is oftentimes conflated with, and I don't think that Ben does this, but I've seen lots of people on Twitter do it, is that they say this is now the end of consulting. And that's the thing that I take major issue with, because I really think that people misunderstand what consulting is actually all about, right? And it's not, it's not the incentive thing. It's not that, some middle manager needs sort of justification to push some project through, and that's why they get McKinsey in, and et cetera, right? I think that's like a pretty cynical view of consulting. I think what oftentimes consulting really is, though, is you have cases where an AI would need to be proactive to actually pull information out. So I like to think about the world as, having online public knowledge that is on the internet and is scrapable, and and then there's like near field public knowledge. You can get a subscription to, let's say, a Gartner report or something, and this is like privately available data, and so you can train or use AI across that. And I know that the deep research team is about to do that with some private data. But I think there's also, let's call it frontier data in the world, which is locked up in people's heads and minds and organizations. And so one of the things that, let's say, consultants often do, and consulting is a very broad field, but like one of the things they'll oftentimes do is speak to internal stakeholders, right, about how they're currently tackling a problem or an approach, and to be able to, and in essence, they're pulling out frontier knowledge from their heads, from their minds. And to be able to do that, you now need an AI that's very good at asking questions, and we don't actually have an AI that's good at asking questions yet. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to look at. The other thing, by the way, with like anyone who's thinking about automating consulting, as it were, right? It's like, I think what you need is, you need an AI that's good at asking questions. You need an AI that's very good at managing a project. So, like when things are going to get done and setting expectations and et cetera. And then the and then the other thing is, you need to be able to package the consulting deliverables in ways that are familiar to the market. And so what I mean by that is, if you look at consultancies, they typically have KM teams or knowledge management teams that have pre-existing like decks and solutions and guides, internal guides for their internal consultants for how to approach a consulting project. Because oftentimes they've actually, they're redoing the same thing. They're rinse and repeating across different players in the market. And so I think taking inspiration from that is how we tackle consulting, not necessarily searching across Google.
One thing that around that is that maybe we did research. It might be that consulting as such, like the big names, they will stay, of course, because they have the brand power, awareness, prestige, and so on and so forth. However, when I use a deep research like the product, can be from Perplexity, can be from Gemini, whatever which one is, what I notice is that it sort of replaces the task that often will be given to a intern, for example, an entry-level analyst. So yes, indeed, let's say like on a big scale, consulting might not be gone as an industry. However, isn't it possible that many consulting related goals will completely disappear?
Oh, absolutely. As I for sure. I think that, we are moving into a world where, let's say, low-level legal services, right, can now be answered by ChatGPT. We're moving into a world where you can update a medical scan and have an opinion from, ChatGPT. We're moving into a world where, you can do secondary research using deep research and ChatGPT and all the other models. So for sure, I mean, I think that, if anything, though, going back to that, I forget the name of that paradox, but everyone started talking about it when, DeepSeek came out. I think what ends up happening is that it actually ends up, proliferating market research, right? Because more and more people will engage with it. I remember I saw on Twitter somewhere, people were talking about like, we really need a flow state inducing AI, whether it's voice AI or something else, something that, your lizard brain uses kind of, half an hour before bed when you're in bed and you're kind of like hunched over in your pillow and you're, swiping through TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever. We need sort of an AI version of that. And then someone said, oh, actually, at night when my partner is watching a show, I'm actually hunched over in my pillow and I am chatting with ChatGPT about various research that I'm doing that I can now easily do just, by typing on my phone. So yeah, it is, it's definitely going to increase the aggregate amount of research that gets done.
It's almost like Given's paradox you were thinking about.
Yes, that's the one.
Given's paradox.
The paradox that everyone learned about.
Nadella says it, right? Satya says it, which is you increase the efficiency of resources can lead to the increased consumption of that resource. So in a way, when we increase the ability to do all this research, people are just going to consume more of it. Well, good thing though, if that do come to fruition, I think a lot of investment bankers, especially the junior analysts, will have a little bit better life, work-life balance. So are the consulting, right? There are a few companies within the services. The higher you move, your life don't actually get easier. It actually gets harder because you have to spot check all the stuff your folks are doing, your teams are doing. But at the same time, you still have to manage the relationship with the clients. You still have to ask the right question as you go. So that's super interesting. And I think, just to add to your thoughts around, like market research, etc., I do think there is an opportunity here because of the proliferation of voice AI, right? You could easily call up someone using voice AI, ask a few questions. You'll probably be able to capture enough information to form an opinion to begin with before you go even deeper. So I'm quite excited about it. I started my career asking people questions around, would you use this software? which I think it will change.
Mm-hmm. And just sorry, I need to say this. Another fascinating thing is I think, like, you were asking people about software usage. Yeah, I think another interesting topic for everyone to think about is what kind of information will we be extracting for experts in the future. And I think, like, if folks in enterprise or industry have used services like Tegus, I think those are kind of like a window into the future in the sense that these are open transcript. They have open transcript libraries that you can subscribe to. A lot of that data is very interesting data that I think will have a lot of potential when it's combined with AI.
Yeah. And I guess the question then becomes, who owns those data, yada yada. We will get to that when the time comes. But I totally agree. There's still a lot I think there's still a lot unlocked to be done on some of this more nuanced information in large organizations, right? I can only imagine what we'll find if you just combine all the transcripts and all the filings of IBM internally. Just imagine the things that you were seeing there. You could say the same for Microsoft, for Google, etc. Cool. And first off, Andrej, thank you so much again for giving us extra 11 minutes of your time. We're really appreciative
Thanks to the two of you,
it.
please.
This is a very good conversation. And I just wrap it up here. Number one, thank you so much, Andrej, again, for sharing your expertise with us. Today, we cover about 4 different topics, everything from voice AI to AI pricing, Stripe's recent announcement, as well as what can deep research and can or cannot do, as well as, I don't know, the doom and gloom of consulting. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and listening. If you like the episode, obviously, share, subscribe. And one more thing, Andrej, if people want to find out about you, where can they go and find you?
Oh, gosh. So I guess 2 venues. One is, add me on LinkedIn. The other is come to London, Bermondsey Street, Watch House. I'm there all the time, and you can spot me in the wild.
Lovely. And there you go, listeners. You know where to find Andrej. Thank you so much again for listening in, and we'll back next week. Thank you.